Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. In this week's episode, I am unpacking some scholarship. The last couple of months, I was unpacking the book Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. However, today I'm going to unpack a short article by Mitch Resnick and Natalie Rusk. The article is titled Coding at a Crossroads, and it is available for free for anybody to read. If you visit the link in the show notes, you will find a link to the author's Google Scholar profiles, as well as a direct link to the paper itself, so you can read it on ACM's website. All right, so there is no abstract for this particular paper. However, if I were to summarize this paper into a single sentence, I would say that this short article discusses some of the challenges in CS and coding education, and summarizes 4 guiding principles educators can use when engaging in coding practices in their classroom. All right, so at the start of this particular article, the authors mentioned that schools and policymakers are actually starting to embrace coding in the class and computer science, and acknowledging that this should be something that is available to all students. However, despite the success of CS and coding in the schools, Resnick and Rusk point out that we still have a lot of work to do. Quote, "If we do not think carefully about the educational strategies and pedagogies for introducing coding, there's a major risk of disappointment and backlash," end quote, from page 120. Now, this is something that really resonates with me, and is actually something that I talk about in an interview with GT Roble, which the interview has not released yet. I believe it will come out on December 7th, so stay tuned for more on that particular discussion. So the authors of this paper point out that the skills people use when they are coding are not just useful for a career in coding or computer science. Quote, "but also for personal fulfillment and civic engagement," end quote. That's from page 120. And these skills specifically are thinking creatively, reasoning systematically, and working collaboratively. So the authors describe some ways people are using the platform Scratch to engage in civic engagement, such as creating projects around how technology could transform society, supporting movements like Black Lives Matter, or projects about the threat of climate change. So in this introduction, they're basically saying, hey, we've made a lot of ground. We've done some great things with computer science and coding and made it so that a lot of people are much more aware of what's going on. However, we as a field need to start having a conversation about the ways that we teach. And the rest of this article talks about the potential direction that we can go as a field. Okay, so the next section of the paper is titled Opportunities and Challenges. So the authors point out that kids are not just learning coding for the sake of learning coding. So instead, they are engaging in coding in order to learn something. Quote, "They are not only learning important mathematical and computational concepts, they are also deepening their understanding of ideas in other disciplines and developing a broad range of problem-solving, design, collaboration, and communication skills," end quote, from page 121. However, the ways in which we teach or facilitate coding classes has an impact, or at least can have an impact, on not only how well kids understand coding concepts and practices, but whether coding itself is viewed as an expressive act that kids can engage in. All right, so there are 4 main challenges that are presented here. One is decontextualized learning. The next one is replication. The next one is not enough time. And the last one is automated assessments. And those category names, by the way, are names that I've provided just for clarification purposes. All right, so the first challenge, decontextualized learning. Here's a quote from pages 121 and 122. Quote, "Too often, schools are introducing students to computer science by teaching them definitions of words associated with computing without providing them with opportunities to learn and apply computational concepts and practices in the context of meaningful activities. For example, some school districts introduce computing to elementary students by teaching them the definition of the word algorithm and the differences between hardware and software, instead of engaging students in active learning through computing activities such as coding an animated story or programming a robot to dance," end quote. So this particular challenge of decontextualized learning is something that myself and many of the guests on the show have also talked about, so I strongly agree with this as a challenge that we need to talk about as a field. So the next one is replication. So rather than encouraging kids to tinker, experiment, debug, prototype, etc., coding is often introduced as replicating existing code or solving problems with one correct solution. So the authors provide an example of 30 identical projects being shared all at once, and they initially thought that this was like a bug on their website that they needed to address, but they then realized that it was 30 different usernames from the same class. So this approach of having kids in a class all create the exact same project in the same way prevents the opportunity for kids to express themselves through creative coding and thinking. Again, this is also something that really resonates with me. As I mentioned before, my classes that I previously worked with, kids were not replicating projects, they were creating their own projects. And in the boot up lessons that I have designed, they're all supposed to be interest driven. Now, unfortunately, I have seen some people actually teach the lessons so that every single kid recreates the example project that I created, but that's not the intention with these lessons. So again, this challenge really resonates with me, and I agree. We should avoid, as a field, replication for replication's sake, and instead focus on creating with code. All right, so the third challenge that's presented in this paper is not enough time. And by not enough time, they mean not just for coding, but also coding with one language or platform. Quote, within this limited time, students might learn some basic terms and concepts, but they don't have the opportunity to put the ideas to use in a meaningful way, and thus are unlikely to be able to apply the ideas in other contexts and other subjects. And in situations where coding is allocated more time, the curriculum often pushes teachers and students to shift from one coding tool to another, rather than providing time for learning a tool well enough for designing projects, solving problems, and communicating ideas. End quote. Page 122. You're going to hear me say this a lot, but again, this really resonates with my own approach. So the kinder and first grade kids that I worked with, they all used Scratch Junior. The second and third grade classes that I worked with all used Scratch. And then grades 4 through 8 had the opportunity to pick from Scratch, to use Sonic Pi, which used the language Ruby and allowed you to code music, to create art and animation with JavaScript through Khan Academy's program, or to create apps using Xcode and Swift. So they had the opportunity to pick 4 different platforms when they're in grades 4 and above. However, I encouraged them to pick one and dive deep into it. So some kids would stick with a single language for multiple years. Probably at least 80% of most classes just stuck with Scratch for each grade level. However, some kids would shift between platforms like every semester or so. And what was interesting is the level of transfer from it. So I would constantly go up to a computer screen and be like, oh, how'd you figure out how to do that? And they'd be like, oh, well, I remembered that I could do this in Scratch, so I wondered if I could do something similar in JavaScript or whatever. So this particular challenge that they're highlighting, if you are spending a short amount of time on one platform and then diving into the next platform and then the next, odds are you're probably going over the same surface level concepts and understandings in different platforms, but are not able to dive as deep as if you had spent the same amount of time on a single platform across the entire year. All right, so the fourth challenge that is presented is on automated assessments. Quote, too often, researchers and educators are adopting automated assessment tools that evaluate student programming projects only by analyzing the code, without considering the project goals, content, design, interface, usability, or documentation. End quote. From page 122. Here's another quote on why this is problematic. Quote, this form of assessment doesn't take into consideration what the student's program is intended to do, how well it accomplishes the student's goals, whether the code works as intended, whether people are able to interact with it, or how the student's thinking develops over a series of projects. End quote. From page 122. So this is one of the reasons why I actually recommend if you're going to use an automated tool, use it for reflective practices rather than for evaluative or assessment practices. So have kids use a tool and then use it as a way to guide their own reflection. So for example, the tool might point out that they don't have any conditional blocks. And then they would go, oh yeah, I could add some conditionals into my project. Or they might go, no, that doesn't make sense for this particular project. I don't need conditionals. All right, so as a quick summary, the 4 challenges that were presented by Resnick and Rusk are decontextualized learning, replication, not enough time, and automated assessments. Again, those are my own summary of each one of those challenges. Okay, so the next section of this paper is titled Computational Fluency. So the authors note that many programs focus so narrowly on coding fluency or computational thinking that they are decontextualized from application or are situated within problems that only have a single correct answer. So in their research, and in my own experience as well, coding can be motivating and meaningful when kids are able to create projects that express their own ideas. So rather than using the term computational thinking on its own, they prefer to, quote, use the phrase computational fluency to describe this ability to use computational techniques to communicate ideas effectively and creatively, end quote, from page 122. So this situates the idea of computational thinking within creative pursuits. And although not everyone will pursue coding for career-related purposes, when, quote, students create their own stories, games, and animations with code, they start to see themselves as creators, developing confidence and pride in their ability to create things and express themselves with new technologies, end quote, from page 123. Now, although the authors are recommending this approach, and I recommend it as well, the authors note that it takes time to develop this kind of fluency. And this particular section of the paper ends with a short example of a kid who used Scratch to become both a computational creator and computational thinker. Okay, so now we get into the main portion of the paper, which is labeled as 4 guiding principles. And they also describe it as the 4 P's of creative learning, which are projects, passion, peers, and play. Quote, these principles provide a framework to guide the design of technologies, activities, curriculum, communities, and spaces to support coding and learning, end quote, from page 124. All right, so let's unpack each one of these 4 guiding principles. So the first one, projects. Quote, provide students with opportunities to work on meaningful projects, not just puzzles or problem-solving activities. So they experience the process of turning an initial idea into a creation that can be shared with others, end quote, from page 124. Okay, so the authors note that there is some value in learning how to code by solving puzzles, and that it is certainly easier for teachers who are new to CS to assess and manage that kind of approach to learning. Quote, but learning to code by solving logic puzzles is somewhat like learning to write by solving crossword puzzles. That's not the way to become truly fluent. Just as students develop fluency with language by writing their own stories, not just playing word games, students develop fluency with coding by creating projects, not just solving puzzles, end quote, from page 124. And again, this really resonates with my own approach, which is why Boot Up's curriculum that I've written is 100% project-based learning, and is what I engaged with in the classes that I facilitated across all grade levels. All right, so the next guiding principle, passion. Quote, allow students to work on projects connected to their interests. They will work longer and harder and learn more in the process, end quote, from page 124. So Resnick and Rusk mention they value platforms and approaches to coding that allow kids to connect with their interests because it allows kids to create and share something that is relevant and meaningful to them. This is such a high priority for them that they actually evaluate Scratch classes or workshops by analyzing how diverse the projects are that come from that experience. So if there are 30 kids or 30 adults within a class on Scratch, they want to see 30 very different or diverse projects coming out of that experience, rather than everyone creating the exact same thing. So here's a quote from page 125. Quote, we often refer to this idea with the phrase, many paths, many styles. Some students make elaborate plans. Others explore and tinker. Some students enjoy telling stories. Others enjoy making patterns. Some students are excited about animals. Others are excited about sports. To ensure coding is for all, it is important to support these diverse entry points and approaches, end quote. Again, this sounds like many of the things that the guests have mentioned on the show and things that I have mentioned in other Unpacking Scholarship episodes. I'm going to have to start finding some papers that I completely disagree with. All right, so the third section of the guiding principles, peers. Quote, encourage collaboration and sharing and help students learn to build on the work of others, end quote, from page 125. So having a community-based platform like Scratch allows kids to have an audience to share creations with. It provides inspiration by seeing what other people have created in the same platform, and allows kids to connect and collaborate with others who have shared interests. Now, that being said, I would argue that we could have all of those things outside of Scratch, or in something that is completely offline. So for example, if you downloaded the offline version of Scratch, you could have it so that kids have an audience to share with inside of their class or school, allow them the opportunity to be able to share and learn from others, and to be able to connect and collaborate with other kids within their class or across other classes or grade levels who have similar interests. So as one example of that, kids in the classes that I worked with could choose who they wanted to work with or work independently on projects. and there were two kids who actually decided to work together on the same project. However, they were both in two different classes. So one kid would come to the class earlier in the day. They would then meet together at lunch and talk about what the first kid worked on. And then the second kid would come into a class later in the day and would continue the work. They would then meet after school and talk about the project's changes that were made to it. So it's this interesting form of like asynchronous collaboration where there was time to work, time to collaborate, time to work, and then time to collaborate again each day. So it was a pretty cool process that they came up with. All right, so the last guiding principle is play. Quote, create an environment where students feel safe to take risks, try new things, and experiment playfully. End quote, from page 126. So play is not viewed as an activity, but as an attitude by the authors. And the authors note that although it may appear more efficient to do direct instruction, they found that, quote, many students became more engaged and gain a greater sense of agency and confidence when they learn through playful experimentation and exploration, end quote, from page 126. I totally agree with this approach, and it's what I did in the classroom. I will say that I did create some resources to help guide students with specific and common questions, but kids walked into class and immediately started working on their own projects without me having to demonstrate anything to the full group. There was very little direct instruction, and whenever there was, it was usually one-on-one, and it was a form of guided direct instruction, where I was guiding them to a solution to their problem without giving them the answer right away. All right, so a quick summary of the 4 guiding principles. So they were projects, passion, peers, and play. And they are recommending that educators and learning spaces have those 4 guiding principles. So the next section is titled Putting the 4 Ps into Practice. And although they recommend the 4 Ps, they do acknowledge that it is hard to actually do this in some formalized learning context. So to help educators see how the 4 Ps can all work together within a formalized space, they provide an example case study of what one teacher did in Tacoma, Washington. So if you're interested in that, I highly recommend reading that section of the paper. So the last main section of this paper is called The Next Decade. Quote, we need to break down barriers across disciplines, providing students with opportunities to work on projects that integrate science, art, engineering, and design. We need to break down barriers across age, allowing people of all ages to learn with and from one another. We need to break down barriers across space, connecting activities in schools, community centers, and homes. And we need to break down barriers across time, enabling children to work on interest-based projects for weeks or months, rather than squeezing projects into the constraints of a class period or curriculum unit, end quote, from page 127. This obviously really resonates with me. As I mentioned before, kids were able to learn from and share with different grade levels and across different classes. So we broke down some of the barriers by age. Kids were sharing not just with the classes in the schools, but also with the community and other schools as well. We're looking at some of the projects that the kids in my classes made. And there were no constraints in terms of having to finish a project by a specific time. So some kids literally worked on projects for multiple years, like those 2 kids who were working on the project asynchronously. The reason why they started doing that is because the previous year they are in the same class together and they worked on a Scratch project all year long, and then they wanted to continue to work on that project, but they were in 2 separate classes in the same grade level the next year, so they came up with that creative asynchronous form of collaboration. So I hope when you're listening to this episode and other episodes, you're thinking of, how can I apply what is being discussed in an interesting way in the classes that I work with? But again, this is difficult, especially if we're going to change the field as a whole, because the authors note that it requires a shift in how many people think about education, not just educators, not just administrators, but also like politicians and parents, community members, etc. All right, so here's the final closing statement from page 127 of this article. Quote, we are at a crossroads. 10 years from now, we hope we can look back and report on a decade of educational change, in which schools have provided students with the time, space, support, and encouragement they need to become fluent with new technologies, so that they can help shape tomorrow's society, end quote. All right, as always with these Unpacking Scholarship episodes, I like to end with some of my lingering questions or thoughts. So one of the questions that I have is, what principles are missing from the 4 Ps of creative learning? So for example, if an administrator would look at these principles, what would they think is missing? What about a student? What about a parent? And another question we might ask is what word might exist that describes a principle that doesn't start with the letter P? Maybe there's a fifth one that starts with the letter R. I don't know. So another question I have is how might we incorporate each of these principles in different learning environments or context? So, for example, if you have kids at home, how could you encourage projects, passion, peers, and play in informal learning or for leisure? So one framework that has been helpful for me with thinking about some of these principles in relation to informal learning contexts is participatory culture, which is what I will discuss 2 weeks from now. Now, with that being said, I hope you enjoyed this quick summary of this particular paper. I highly recommend reading it. It's only 8 pages long, so it's a quick read. And you can find that in the show notes, again, by clicking the link in the description of the app that you're listening to this on, or by going to jaredoleary.com and then clicking on the show notes for this episode, where I link directly to the article. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope you stay tuned next week for an interview, and 2 weeks from now from a discussion on participatory culture. If you did enjoy this episode, please consider sharing with another educator or CS educator who might be interested in these concepts. I hope you're all having a wonderful week and are staying safe.